Before he was the Mahatma, he was just Mohandas, a quiet, awkward child with a deep sense of justice. Tonight, we trace the entire journey of the man who changed the course of empires, not with weapons, but with silence, hunger, and soul force. From the bustling streets of Porbandar to the salt-stained shores of Dandi, his path was paved with simplicity, strength, and sacrifice. Gandhi's life wasn't just history, it was a quiet revolution whispered across the world. Let's lie back and slowly walk beside him. If peaceful tales of powerful lives help you drift off, you've found the right companion for the night, my friend. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you never miss a gentle journey through the stories that shaped our world, one soft breath at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. In the quiet coastal town of Porbandar, where the Arabian Sea lapped against the shores of the Kathiawar Peninsula, a small whitewashed house stood like countless others in this ancient trading port. The year was 1869, and on October 2nd, as the monsoon rains had given way to clearer skies, a child was born who would one day shake the foundations of the British Empire. But on that autumn day, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi entered the world as an unremarkable infant in a thoroughly ordinary, middle-class family. The Gandhi household was modest but respectable. His grandfather, Uttam Chand Gandhi, had risen from humble merchant origins to become the Dewan, or Prime Minister, of the tiny princely state of Porbandar. This was no small achievement in a society where such positions were typically reserved for those born into privilege. The family belonged to the Mod Bania caste, a community of traders and moneylenders who had settled in Gujarat generations earlier. Mohandas's father, Karamchand Gandhi, known affectionately as Kaba Gandhi, had inherited both his father's position and his administrative talents. Despite having little formal education, Kaba Gandhi possessed the practical wisdom and moral authority that made him an effective leader. He was a man of contradictions, generous and brave, yet plagued by a terrible temper that would flare without warning. His colleagues respected his judgment, but his family walked carefully around his moods. The boy's mother, Putlibai, represented the spiritual heart of the household. Every morning before dawn, she would rise and make her way to the family temple, where she would spend long hours in prayer and meditation. Her devotion was not mere ritual, but a deep, personal communion with the divine that colored every aspect of her daily life. She fasted regularly, often going without food on the slightest pretext, if a family member fell ill, if the monsoons were late, or simply as an act of religious devotion. The townspeople of Porbandar held her in high regard, seeking her counsel on matters both temporal and spiritual. Young Mohandas, whom the family called Monia, was a painfully shy child who seemed to shrink from attention. Unlike his more boisterous siblings, he preferred the solitude of his own company to the rough play of other children. Each morning, he would walk to the local school, his small frame almost disappearing among the crowds of more confident students. The moment classes ended, he would dart away, racing home as if pursued by invisible demons. His favorite retreat was the family's modest library, where he would lose himself for hours among the few books that lined the wooden shelves. These volumes, mostly religious texts and traditional stories, became his closest companions. While other children played in the dusty streets of Porbandar, Monia would curl up in a corner, reading tales of heroes and saints, their adventures far more appealing than anything the real world could offer. The child displayed an unusual moral sensitivity that both impressed and worried his family. Once, when one of his older brothers playfully pulled his ear and ran away laughing, Monia refused to chase him or retaliate. Instead, he stood perfectly still, tears streaming down his face, and asked his mother a question that would haunt the family for years. Why should I hit my brother? Why should I hit anyone? It was an extraordinary response from a child who had barely learned to form complete sentences. This moral fastidiousness extended to his choice of friends. In a society rigidly divided by caste, where contact with those deemed untouchable could result in social ostracism, young Monia befriended Uka, the son of a family of sweepers. When Monia received sweets, a rare treat in those days, he would immediately seek out Uka to share them, ignoring the shocked whispers of neighbors and the gentle rebukes of family members who feared for their social standing. The daily rhythms of life in Porbandar were dictated by the monsoons, the tides, and the ancient traditions that governed every aspect of existence. The town was a bustling trading center where merchants from across the Arabian Sea came to buy and sell goods. The air was filled with the scent of spices, the sound of bargaining in multiple languages, and the constant creaking of wooden ships being loaded and unloaded at the harbor. In this environment, young Mohandas absorbed lessons that would shape his entire worldview. He watched his father navigate the complex politics of a princely state, balancing the demands of tradition with the practical needs of governance. He observed his mother's quiet strength, her ability to maintain her principles while managing a large household. Most importantly, he learned that power, whether political or moral, came with responsibilities that could not be ignored. The boy's education followed the traditional pattern of the time. He learned to read and write in Gujarati, the local language, and was introduced to basic arithmetic and religious texts. His teachers found him diligent but unremarkable, a quiet student who completed his assignments without complaint, but showed no particular brilliance. What they could not see was the intense inner life that was developing behind his shy exterior. At home, Monia was expected to participate in the elaborate religious observances that dominated the family's routine. He would sit quietly during the evening prayers, watching as his mother chanted ancient verses with a devotion that seemed to transport her to another realm entirely. These sessions, which could last for hours, introduced him to concepts of duty, sacrifice, and the search for truth that would later become the foundation of his political philosophy. The household operated according to strict principles of economy and frugality. Nothing was wasted. Leftover food was carefully preserved, worn clothes were mended and passed down, and every rupee was accounted for with meticulous precision. This was not poverty, but a deliberate choice to live simply, a value system that viewed excess as both wasteful and morally corrupting. As Monia grew older, his parents began to worry about his future. In a society where social connections and family alliances determined one's prospects, his extreme shyness and preference for solitude were serious handicaps. They watched with growing concern as he continued to avoid social gatherings, preferring to spend his time alone with his book, or in quiet conversation with his friend Uka. The family's social standing, built carefully over generations, required constant maintenance. As the son of the Dewan, Mohandas was expected to eventually take on responsibilities that would require confidence, social grace, and the ability to navigate complex political relationships. His current behavior suggested he was ill-equipped for such a role. By the time he reached his early teens, the gap between expectations and reality had become impossible to ignore. His parents realized that dramatic action would be necessary if their youngest son was ever to take his place in the world. The question that began to dominate family discussions was not whether Mohandas would need to change, but how such a transformation could be accomplished. The answer, when it came, would set in motion a chain of events that no one in the modest whitewashed house in Porbandar could possibly have anticipated. What forces, you might wonder, could transform such a withdrawn and timid boy into someone capable of challenging the greatest empire the world had ever known? The solution to young Mohandas's social difficulties arrived in the form of a marriage proposal that would forever alter the trajectory of his life. In 1882, when he was barely 13 years old, his parents arranged his wedding to Kasturbai Mukherjee, a girl from a respectable merchant family. The ceremony took place according to ancient traditions, with elaborate rituals that neither the bride nor groom fully understood. For Mohandas, the marriage represented not romance but another overwhelming social obligation that he was expected to navigate without guidance. The early years of this union were marked by the typical awkwardness of childhood marriages. Kasturbai, who was also 13, brought her own strong will and practical nature to the relationship. While Mohandas retreated into his books and inner contemplations, she managed the daily realities of their shared household with an efficiency that both impressed and intimidated him. Their relationship would evolve over decades, eventually becoming one of mutual respect and deep partnership. But in these early years, it added another layer of complexity to an already introspective young man's life. School continued to be a trial for Mohandas. He completed his studies at the local high school in Rajkot, where his family had moved when his father was appointed Dewan of that state. His academic performance was adequate, but uninspiring. He struggled particularly with mathematics and science, subjects that required the kind of logical precision that seemed at odds with his introspective nature. His teachers noted his diligence and good behavior, but saw no signs of exceptional ability or leadership potential. As he approached the completion of his secondary education, the question of his future became increasingly urgent. The traditional path for a young man of his background would have been to join the local administrative service, following in his father's footsteps. However, Gandhi had bigger ambitions for his son. He envisioned Mohandas as a lawyer, a profession that would elevate the family's status and provide greater economic security. The decision to send him to England for legal training was both bold and controversial. In the 1880s, the journey to London was expensive, dangerous, and culturally challenging. More seriously, it violated fundamental religious principles that prohibited Orthodox Hindus from crossing the black waters of the ocean, which was believed to result in spiritual contamination that could never be fully cleansed. The family's announcement of their intentions sparked fierce opposition from the local religious community. The Mod Baniya Caste Council convened a formal meeting to discuss the matter, ultimately passing a resolution that declared any member who travelled to England would be expelled from the community. This was no minor social inconvenience. Such ostracism could destroy a family's business relationships, marriage prospects, and social standing for generations. Faced with this opposition, Mohandas himself wavered. The prospect of leaving everything familiar terrified him, but the alternative, remaining trapped in a provincial life that offered little scope for growth, seemed equally daunting. His mother, Putlibai, became the key figure in resolving his dilemma. She agreed to permit the journey, but only after extracting 3 solemn vows. He must not touch wine, meat, or women during his time abroad. These vows, made before a family, priest, and witnessed by his mother and brother, would prove to be far more than symbolic gestures. They became the foundation of a rigid personal discipline that would define Gandhi's character for the rest of his life. In London, where meat and alcohol were integral to social and professional life, these restrictions would force him to develop alternative sources of strength and community. On September 4, 1888, just 1 month before his 19th birthday, Mohandas boarded the steamship Safari at Bombay Harbour. The The journey to London took nearly 3 weeks, providing ample time for seasickness, homesickness, and increasingly desperate second thoughts about the entire enterprise. He spoke no English beyond the basics, had never seen a European city, and knew virtually nothing about British customs or legal procedures. His arrival in London in late September 1888 marked the beginning of what he would later describe as the most formative period of his youth. The city was overwhelming in every possible way, vast, noisy, expensive, and utterly alien to someone raised in the quiet streets of Kathiawar. The weather was cold and damp, the food was inedible, given his dietary restrictions, and the social customs were incomprehensible. His first months were a struggle for basic survival. He rented a small room in a boarding house and attempted to maintain his vegetarian diet in a city where such practices were virtually unknown. His landlady, after several unsuccessful attempts to convince him to eat meat, simply gave up trying to feed him properly. He learned to cook basic meals for himself, shopping carefully for vegetables and fruits, while avoiding the countless restaurants and pubs that formed the social centre of London life. The financial pressure was constant and severe. His family was spending a significant portion of their annual income to support his studies, money they could ill afford. To economize, he walked everywhere, cooked his own meals, and avoided all forms of entertainment that required payment. His wardrobe consisted of a few carefully maintained suits, purchased second-hand and worn repeatedly until they began to show signs of wear. The academic requirements at the Inner Temple, where he was enrolled to study law, were surprisingly modest. The actual legal curriculum consisted mainly of reading prescribed texts and attending a specified number of dinners at the Inn of Court. These formal dinners, where students and barristers gathered to eat and converse, were intended to provide practical education in legal culture and professional networking. For Mohandas, however, these dinners became a source of constant anxiety and social awkwardness. His vegetarian requirements meant that he often sat before empty plates while his companions enjoyed elaborate meals. His limited English made conversation difficult, and his natural shyness was magnified by cultural unfamiliarity. He would sit in silence, watching other students forge the relationships that would define their professional futures, while feeling increasingly isolated and out of place. The breakthrough came through an unexpected discovery. One day, while walking through the streets of London, he noticed a small bookshop displaying a volume titled The Ethics of Diet in its window. This book introduced him to the idea that vegetarianism was not merely a religious obligation, but a rational choice, supported by moral, health, and economic arguments. More importantly, it revealed the existence of the London Vegetarian Society, a community of like-minded individuals who had chosen to reject meat for philosophical reasons. Joining the Vegetarian Society transformed Gandhi's London experience from one of isolation to one of intellectual and social engagement. The Society's meetings provided him with his first opportunities for public speaking, organizing, and writing. He contributed articles to the Society's journal, delivered lectures at public meetings, and helped organize vegetarian restaurants and boarding houses for visitors to London. Through the Society, he met a diverse group of intellectuals, religious seekers, and social reformers who introduced him to ideas that would profoundly influence his later thinking. He encountered theosophy, a mystical movement that sought to synthesize Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. He read the Bhagavad Gita for the first time, not in its original Sanskrit, but in Sir Edwin Arnold's English translation, and was struck by its message of selfless action and spiritual duty. These new intellectual influences began to reshape his understanding of his own religious heritage. The Hinduism he had absorbed as a child was largely ritualistic and social, focused on caste obligations and family traditions. Through his London studies, he began to see Hinduism as part of a larger human search for truth and meaning that connected it to Christianity, Islam, and other world religions. His daily routine in London gradually took on the characteristics that would define his later life. Early rising, simple vegetarian meals, long walks for both exercise and economy, extensive reading in multiple languages and careful attention to personal hygiene and health. He learned to live on very little money while maintaining his principles, a skill that would prove invaluable in his later political career. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The shy, awkward boy who had arrived in London began to develop confidence in his ability to navigate unfamiliar situations while maintaining his core values. He learned to speak publicly, to organize meetings, to write persuasively, and to build coalitions around shared principles. Most importantly, he discovered that his apparent weaknesses, his vegetarianism, his religious commitments, his preference for simple living, could become sources of strength when properly understood and applied. When he passed his bar examinations in June 1891 and was called to the bar, he had spent nearly 3 years in one of the world's great imperial capitals. He had lived as a racial and religious minority, navigated complex social and professional hierarchies, and developed a network of international contacts. The experience had not made him British, but it had given him the tools to engage with British culture and institutions on equal terms. As he prepared for his return to India, Gandhi faced a crucial question. How would he apply the skills and insights he had gained in London to the very different challenges awaiting him at home? The answer would not be long in coming, but it would take him in a direction that neither he nor his family could possibly have anticipated. The steamship that carried Mohandas Gandhi back to Bombay Harbour in June 1891 brought with it a young man significantly transformed from the timid teenager who had departed 3 years earlier. He had passed his bar examinations, been called to practice law in England, and acquired a veneer of Western sophistication that marked him as one of the new generation of Indian professionals. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay deep uncertainties about his future and his place in a rapidly changing society. His homecoming was marked by tragedy that would overshadow all his professional achievements. His mother, Putlabai, had died while he was still in London, but his family had delayed informing him of her passing until after his examinations. Although news came as a devastating blow to someone whose moral development had been so deeply influenced by her example of selfless devotion and spiritual discipline. Her death left a void in his life that would never be completely filled, and intensified his already serious approach to questions of duty and sacrifice. The reunion with his wife, Kasturbai, was equally challenging. During his 3-year absence, she had matured from a girl into a young woman, managing household responsibilities and caring for extended family members with increasing competence and confidence. Gandhi, meanwhile, had developed intellectual interests and social perspectives that were completely foreign to her experience. The gap between them seemed wider than ever, despite their shared history and mutual affection. His efforts to establish a legal practice in Bombay met with immediate and disheartening failure. The legal profession in the presidency cities was dominated by established firms with extensive networks of contacts and generations of client relationships. Gandhi's London credentials impressed few potential clients who preferred lawyers with proven track records and intimate knowledge of local customs and procedures. His first court appearance became a humiliating disaster that would haunt him for years. Called upon to cross-examine a witness in a simple civil case, Gandhi found himself so overwhelmed by nervousness that he was unable to speak. He sat in silence for several minutes while the judge, opposing counsel, and spectators waited for him to begin. Finally, he rose from his seat, returned the brief to his client, and refunded the fee. The incident was widely discussed in Bombay legal circles, confirming the suspicions of those who doubted whether foreign training could compensate for lack of practical experience. Facing professional ruin in Bombay, Gandhi retreated to Rajkot, where his family's political connections offered some hope of employment. He attempted to establish a modest practice handling petitions and applications for local residents dealing with government bureaucracy. This work was both tedious and poorly paid, involving long hours of copying documents and waiting in government offices for the attention of minor officials. Even this humble beginning was threatened by his political naivety and moral rigidity. When his brother asked him to use family connections to influence a case involving a local businessman, Gandhi not only refused but lectured his brother about the impropriety of such requests. This stance, while ethically admirable, alienated potential clients who expected their lawyers to use whatever advantages were available to advance their interests. The situation became untenable when Gandhi fell afoul of a British political agent, whose cooperation was essential for anyone hoping to practice law in the princely states. The incident arose from a misunderstanding about proper protocol during an official meeting, but it effectively ended any prospect of building a successful legal career in Gujarat. At the age of 24, Gandhi found himself professionally isolated and financially desperate, with a growing family to support and no clear path forward. It was at this lowest point that an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Dada Abdullah, a prosperous Indian merchant based in Natal, South Africa, was seeking legal representation for a complex commercial dispute. The case involved competing claims to a substantial inheritance and required someone familiar with both Indian customs and British legal procedures. Abdullah had heard of Gandhi through mutual contacts in Kathiawar and was impressed by his London credentials. The offer was both generous and mysterious. Abdullah proposed to pay Gandhi $105 for a year's work, plus first-class travel expenses and accommodation. This was more money than Gandhi could hope to earn in several years of practice in India, yet Abdullah was vague about the specific nature of the work required. He would serve as the firm's representative in the case, but it was unclear whether he would function as a lawyer, a consultant, or simply a well-educated intermediary. Gandhi's family was divided about the proposal. His London experience had demonstrated his ability to adapt to foreign environments, but South Africa represented an even greater cultural leap into the unknown. Unlike London, where his status as a student had provided a clear social role, in South Africa he would be entering a complex racial hierarchy where his position would be ambiguous and potentially dangerous. The financial pressures ultimately proved decisive. Gandhi's failed attempts to establish a practice had exhausted the family's resources, and his growing household could not survive on the minimal income from petition writing. More importantly, the South African opportunity offered a chance to escape the professional dead end that seemed to await him in India. On April 24, 1893, Gandhi boarded the steamship Safari in Bombay Harbour for the 3-week journey to Durban. He carried with him a first-class ticket, several law books, a limited wardrobe of European-style clothing, and letters of introduction from Abdullah's associates in India. What he did not carry was any realistic understanding of the racial system that governed every aspect of life in British colonial South Africa. The voyage itself was relatively comfortable, as Gandhi travelled in first-class accommodations and was treated with the courtesy typically accorded to well-dressed Indian professionals. He spent his time reading about South African law and practicing his English in preparation for what he assumed would be routine legal work. The other passengers, mostly British officials and businessmen travelling to take up colonial positions, treated him with polite indifference. This comfortable illusion was shattered within hours of his arrival in Durban in late May 1893. The port city was a bustling commercial centre where Indians formed a substantial minority of the population, working as traders, labourers and clerks. However, Gandhi quickly discovered that legal equality and social reality were entirely different things in colonial Natal. His first confrontation with the racial system occurred within days of his arrival when he appeared in a Durban court to observe legal proceedings. The European magistrate immediately ordered him to remove his turban, explaining that Indians were not permitted to wear headgear in court. Gandhi politely refused, arguing that the turban was part of his traditional dress and that he was appearing as a qualified barrister. The magistrate insisted, and Gandhi chose to leave the courtroom rather than comply with what he viewed as an arbitrary and discriminatory requirement. This incident was widely reported in the local press, establishing Gandhi's reputation as a troublemaker before he had even begun his legal work. The coverage was uniformly hostile, with editorials questioning whether Indians who refused to respect local customs should be permitted to practice law in colonial courts. For someone whose professional reputation had already been damaged by his failures in India, this publicity was deeply troubling. The real shock, however, came a week later when Gandhi was traveling to Pretoria on business for Abdullah's firm. Despite holding a first-class ticket, he was ordered by railway officials to move to the third-class carriage reserved for coloured passengers. When he refused, citing his valid ticket and paid fare, he was unceremoniously ejected from the train at Maritzburg station. The night he spent in the unheated waiting room of that remote railway station would later be remembered as the turning point of his life. Sitting alone in the cold with his overcoat confiscated along with his luggage, Gandhi experienced what he would describe as a moment of absolute clarity about his situation and his responsibilities. He was not merely an individual lawyer dealing with professional difficulties, but a representative of all Indians confronting a system designed to deny their basic human dignity. The young man who had struggled to speak in a Bombay courtroom began to formulate a response that would draw upon everything he had learned about law, organization, and moral authority during his years in London. He would not simply complete his legal work and return to India, as originally planned. Instead, he would stay in South Africa and dedicate himself to challenging the racial laws that govern the lives of its Indian population. As dawn broke over the Maritzburg station, Gandhi began to envision a campaign that would combine legal advocacy with mass organization and moral protest. He had no idea that this decision would keep him in South Africa for the next 21 years, or that the methods he would develop there would eventually bring down the British Empire in India. All he knew was that the system he had encountered was both legally questionable and morally indefensible, and that someone with his education and background had an obligation to resist it. The question that would guide his next 2 decades had crystallized during that long, cold night. How could a small community of traders and laborers challenge laws backed by the full power of the colonial state? The answer would require him to develop entirely new forms of political action that combined his legal training, his religious principles, and his hard-won understanding of how to organize people across cultural and class divisions. The morning sun that rose over Maritzburg station on June 8, 1893, illuminated a young man who had undergone a fundamental transformation during his night of cold reflection. Gandhi gathered his scattered belongings and resumed his journey to Pretoria, but the passive compliance that had characterized his earlier life had been replaced by a steely determination to understand and challenge the system that had humiliated him. The remainder of his journey to Pretoria provided a series of additional lessons in the realities of racial hierarchy in South Africa. At Charlestown, he was forced to travel by stagecoach, where the driver repeatedly demanded that he sit outside with the luggage rather than inside with the white passengers. When Gandhi refused, the driver attempted to physically force him from his seat, only backing down when other passengers intervened. Each mile of the journey reinforced the message that his legal qualifications and first-class tickets meant nothing in a society organized around racial supremacy. Pretoria the administrative capital of the Transvaal Republic, presented yet another set of challenges. As the headquarters of the Boer government, the city was dominated by Afrikaner officials who regarded all Indians with suspicion and contempt. The legal system was conducted in Dutch and English, languages that Gandhi spoke imperfectly, and the procedures differed significantly from both British and Indian practice. His client's case, which had seemed straightforward in Durban, proved to involve complex questions of inheritance law, property rights, and commercial relationships that would require months of careful preparation. The case itself centered around a family dispute over trading rights and property ownership involving Abdullah's relatives and business partners. The financial stakes were enormous, the equivalent of several years' income for a successful lawyer. But the legal issues were tangled in cultural misunderstandings and personal animosities that had festered for years. Gandhi quickly realized that conventional legal advocacy would be insufficient to resolve the underlying conflicts. His approach to the case reflected lessons learned during his London years about the importance of building consensus and finding common ground. Rather than preparing for an adversarial trial, he spent weeks meeting with all parties to understand their real interests and concerns. He discovered that much of the conflict stemmed from miscommunication and wounded pride rather than irreconcilable differences over money or property. Through patient negotiation and careful attention to cultural sensitivities, Gandhi was able to broker a settlement that satisfied all parties while avoiding the expense and uncertainty of a lengthy trial. The agreement was structured as a series of graduated payments that allowed the losing party to preserve dignity while ensuring that the winning party received fair compensation. This successful outcome established Gandhi's reputation as a skilled negotiator and problem solver within the Indian commercial community. More importantly, the case introduced him to the broader challenges facing Indians in South Africa. As he traveled between Durban, Pretoria, and the smaller towns where Indian traders conducted business, he encountered a legal system designed to restrict Indian economic activity and political participation at every level. The 3 annual tax imposed on Indian laborers was deliberately set at a level intended to force them to return to India. Trading licenses were increasingly difficult to obtain, and existing businesses faced constant harassment from local officials. The immigration laws were particularly Byzantine in their complexity and discriminatory in their application. Indian were prohibited from moving freely between the different colonies and republics that made up South Africa. Those who left the country for any reason, even briefly, faced lengthy bureaucratic procedures and substantial fees to regain entry. Marriage laws were structured to prevent Indian families from achieving legal stability, while property ownership was restricted through a maze of regulations that changed frequently and without notice. Gandhi's legal training enabled him to identify the constitutional and procedural weaknesses in many of these restrictions, but his political education was just beginning. The Indian community in South Africa was divided by religion, region, language, class, and legal status in ways that made collective action extremely difficult. Wealthy merchants like his client Abdullah had little in common with indentured laborers working on sugar plantations. Tamil-speaking Indians from South India were culturally distant from Gujarati-speaking traders from his own background. Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and Parsis maintained separate religious and social institutions that rarely cooperated on secular issues. The challenge of organizing such a diverse community required skills that Gandhi had begun to develop during his work with the London Vegetarian Society, but on a much larger scale and with far higher stakes. He began by writing letters to local newspapers, carefully documenting instances of discrimination and challenging the legal foundations of anti-Indian legislation. His training in English legal writing served him well in crafting arguments that were both technically sound and morally compelling. His first major public address came in June 1894 when he was invited to speak at a farewell party organized by Abdullah before his planned return to India. The event was intended as a simple expression of gratitude for his successful handling of the commercial case, but Gandhi used the occasion to deliver a detailed analysis of the discriminatory legislation then pending in the Natal legislature. His speech, which lasted over an hour, documented the legal basis for Indian rights under British law and outlined the economic and moral arguments against racial discrimination. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Indian merchants and professionals in attendance had heard plenty of complaints about their treatment, but Gandhi was the first person with the legal expertise and language skills to articulate a comprehensive challenge to the discriminatory system. By the end of the evening, they had convinced him to cancel his return to India and establish a permanent legal practice in Natal. The decision to remain in South Africa was both professional and personal. Professionally, it offered the opportunity to build a legal practice around civil rights advocacy, work that was both financially rewarding and personally meaningful. Personally, it provided an escape from the professional disappointments and family pressures that had made his life in India so difficult. Most importantly, it allowed him to pursue a form of legal practice that combined technical expertise with moral purpose in ways that purely commercial work could never provide. The founding of the Natal Indian Congress in July 1894 marked Gandhi's first major organizational achievement and established the template for his later political work. Unlike the Indian National Congress, which met annually for a few days of speeches and resolutions, the Natal Indian Congress was designed as a permanent organization capable of sustained political action. Its membership included Indians from all religious and regional backgrounds, united around the shared goal of legal equality and economic opportunity. The organization's first major campaign focused on opposing the 3 annual tax on Indian immigrants, a measure designed to force Indian laborers to return to India after completing their indenture contracts. Gandhi's strategy combined legal challenges based on constitutional principles with mass petitions and publicity campaigns designed to build public support. He organized petition drives that collected thousands of signatures, wrote detailed legal briefs challenging the tax's constitutionality, and coordinated with allies in India and London to build international pressure on the colonial government. The campaign also provided Gandhi with his first experience of mass organizing among Indian laborers, a population quite different from the merchants and professionals who formed the core of the Congress membership. These men and women worked under conditions of near slavery, lived in company barracks, and faced constant threats of violence and deportation if they challenged their employers. Building trust with this community required Gandhi to demonstrate that legal advocacy could produce concrete improvements in their daily lives. His success in this effort surprised even his closest supporters. Gandhi's willingness to visit labor camps, attend religious ceremonies in multiple traditions, and address meetings in Tamil and Hindi, as well as English, helped bridge the cultural divisions that had previously prevented effective political organizing. His legal background enabled him to explain complex issues in practical terms, while his personal commitment to simple living and religious observance demonstrated that he was not seeking to profit from their struggles. The methods he developed. During these early campaigns, careful legal research combined with mass organizing, publicity campaigns designed to build international support, and personal conduct designed to demonstrate moral authority would become the foundation of his later political work in India. But in 1894, they were simply practical responses to the immediate challenges facing the Indian community in South Africa. As the year drew to a close, Gandhi found himself in a position he could never have imagined when he first arrived in Durban. He was the acknowledged political leader of a substantial minority community, the head of a growing legal practice, and an increasingly prominent public figure whose activities were closely watched by both supporters and opponents. The transformation from failed lawyer to civil rights advocate had taken less than 2 years, but it had required him to develop entirely new skills and perspectives about the relationship between law, politics, and moral authority. The question that would guide his next phase of development was becoming increasingly clear. How could the methods he had developed for challenging specific pieces of discriminatory legislation be expanded into a comprehensive strategy for transforming South African society? The answer would require him to move beyond conventional legal and political approaches towards something entirely new in the history of political resistance. The success of the Natal Indian Congress in organizing opposition to the 3 tax had demonstrated the potential for sustained political action, but it had also revealed the limitations of conventional advocacy in a system designed to exclude Indian voices from meaningful participation. Gandhi's legal practice was thriving by 1895, with offices in both Durban and Pretoria serving Indian merchants, labourers, and professionals throughout South Africa. Yet each legal victory seemed to prompt new discriminatory legislation, suggesting that the fundamental problem lay not in specific laws, but in the underlying structure of colonial society. The daily routine of Gandhi's legal practice brought him into contact with every aspect of the Indian experience in South Africa. His morning hours were typically spent in court, arguing cases involving trading licenses, property disputes, and immigration restrictions. The afternoon was reserved for office consultations where a steady stream of clients sought help with marriage registrations, tax assessments, and employment contracts. His evenings were devoted to political organizing, correspondence with supporters in India and London, and the preparation of petitions and legal briefs challenging discriminatory legislation. This immersion in the legal system revealed patterns of discrimination that went far beyond the obvious injustices that had first caught his attention. The courts applied different standards of evidence when Indians were involved, requiring documentation and verification that were routinely waived. For white litigants, marriage laws were interpreted in ways that made it virtually impossible for Indian families to achieve legal recognition, while property regulations were enforced selectively to prevent Indian commercial expansion. The complexity of these challenges required Gandhi to develop new approaches that combined legal expertise with mass education and international publicity. He began publishing a weekly newspaper, Indian Opinion, which served multiple functions within his emerging political strategy. The publication provided detailed coverage of discriminatory legislation and court decisions, helping Indian readers understand the legal framework that governed their lives. It also served as a platform for Gandhi's evolving political philosophy as he used editorials and feature articles to explore questions of duty, resistance, and moral authority. The newspaper's production became a laboratory for Gandhi's experiments in simple living and cooperative organization. The printing was done at a settlement he established outside Durban, where Indian families could live according to principles of economic cooperation and religious tolerance. This community, which he called Phoenix Settlement, represented his first attempt to create a model society based on the values he hoped to promote throughout South Africa. Life at Phoenix Settlement followed a carefully structured routine designed to demonstrate the practical application of Gandhi's emerging philosophy. Residents rose before dawn for communal prayers that included readings from Hindu, Christian, and Islamic texts. The morning hours were devoted to physical labor, farming, construction, and the production of Indian Opinion, with each person contributing according to their abilities, regardless of their background or education. Meals were simple vegetarian, fare prepared and consumed communally with strict attention to economy and nutrition. The settlement's educational program reflected Gandhi's belief that political liberation required personal transformation. Children received instruction in multiple languages, religious traditions, and practical skills, while adults participated in regular discussions of political and philosophical questions. The goal was to create citizens capable of self-governance. In both personal and political spheres, people who could maintain their principles under pressure while working effectively with others across cultural and class divisions. This emphasis on personal discipline and moral authority became increasingly central to Gandhi's political strategy as conventional legal approaches proved insufficient to address systemic discrimination. The Transvaal government's passage of the Asiatic Registration Act in 1906 marked a turning point in his thinking about the relationship between individual conscience and political resistance. The law required all Indians over 8 years old to register with government authorities, submit to fingerprinting, and carry identification passes at all times. Failure to comply resulted in fines, imprisonment, and deportation. The legislation was clearly designed to humiliate the Indian community and force mass emigration through bureaucratic harassment. Traditional legal challenges would take years to resolve and offered little prospect of success, given the discriminatory composition of the courts and legislature. Political negotiations were equally futile, as the government had demonstrated its contempt for Indian opinions through the very passage of the Act. Gandhi's response drew upon everything he had learned about organization, communication, and moral authority during his 13 years in South Africa. At a mass meeting of Indians in Johannesburg on September 11, 1906, he proposed a new form of resistance that he initially called passive resistance, but later renamed satyagraha, literally truth force, or holding firmly to truth. The concept was both simple and revolutionary. Rather than attempting to change discriminatory laws through legal or political channels, Indians would simply refuse to obey them, accepting whatever consequences the government chose to impose. This resistance would be entirely non-violent, with participants committed to treating their opponents with respect and courtesy, even while defying their authority. Most importantly, the campaign would continue indefinitely, regardless of the personal costs to individual participants. The first Satyagraha campaign tested both Gandhi's organizational skills and his evolving philosophy of non-violent resistance. The initial response was overwhelming, with thousands of Indians pledging to refuse registration and accept imprisonment rather than submit to what they viewed as legalized humiliation. Gandhi himself was among the first to be arrested in January 1908, and his 2-month imprisonment in Pretoria Central Prison provided him with time for reflection and study that would profoundly influence his future development. The physical conditions of prison life, the hard labor, inadequate food, and overcrowded cells might have been expected to break the will of someone accustomed to a comfortable middle-class existence. Instead, Gandhi found the experience liberating in ways he had not anticipated. Stripped of his possessions, separated from his family and colleagues, and forced to live according to the prison's rigid schedule, he discovered that his sense of purpose and inner peace were independent of external circumstances. His daily routine in prison followed the patterns he had established at Phoenix Settlement, but with even greater simplicity and discipline. He rose at dawn for private meditation and prayer, spent the daylight hours in whatever labor was assigned, and used the evening hours for study and reflection. He read extensively during this period, working through texts on religion, philosophy, and political theory that would shape his understanding of the relationship between personal and political transformation. The most significant discovery was that imprisonment, rather than weakening the Satyagraha movement, actually strengthened it by demonstrating the participants' commitment to their principles. Each arrest generated publicity that exposed the arbitrary nature of the discriminatory laws, while the peaceful behavior of the prisoners highlighted the contrast between their moral conduct and the government's reliance on force. International opinion, particularly in India and Britain, began to shift in favor of the Indian position as reports of mass arrests and harsh treatment reached the global press. The campaign continued for 8 years, with periods of intense confrontation. alternating with negotiations and temporary compromises. Gandhi was imprisoned repeatedly, spending a total of nearly 2 years in South African jails while refining his understanding of non-violent resistance and its potential applications. Each period of imprisonment provided opportunities for study, reflection, and the development of personal disciplines that would serve him throughout his later career. The movement also evolved organizationally, expanding beyond the Indian merchant and professional classes to include indentured laborers, domestic workers, and Indian women. This broadening of participation required Gandhi to develop new forms of leadership that could maintain unity across cultural, economic, and gender divisions while sustaining morale during long periods of government repression. The inclusion of women in the Satyagraha movement marked a particularly significant development in Gandhi's political thinking. His wife, Kasturbai, who had initially been skeptical of his political activities, became one of the movement's most effective organizers and speakers. Her participation, along with that of hundreds of other Indian women, demonstrated that non-violent resistance could transcend traditional gender roles while respecting cultural sensitivities about women's public participation. The final phase of the South African struggle began in 1913 with a government decision to invalidate marriages performed according to Hindu and Islamic rites. This direct attack on family relationships provoked the most widespread resistance of the entire campaign, with thousands of Indians participating in protests that spread from the Transvaal to Natal and the Cape Colony. The government's response was correspondingly harsh, with mass arrests, deportations, and the shooting of unarmed protesters. The crisis reached its climax in November 1913 when Indian coal miners in Natal went on strike in support of the Satyagraha movement. The strike, which eventually involved over 50,000 workers, brought the colonial economy to a standstill and focused international attention on the treatment of Indians in South Africa. Gandhi, who had been released from prison to participate in negotiations, led a march of over 2,000 protesters from Natal into the Transvaal, courting arrest while maintaining absolute discipline and non-violence. The government's inability to contain the movement through force, combined with mounting international pressure, finally compelled serious negotiations. The resulting Gandhi-Smuts Agreement of 1914 addressed most of the Indian community's major grievances. The 3 tax was abolished, Hindu and Islamic marriages were recognized, and immigration restrictions were eased. While the agreement fell short of full equality, it represented a remarkable victory for non-violent resistance against overwhelming odds. As Gandhi prepared to leave South Africa in July 1914, he could look back on 21 years that had transformed both himself and the Indian community he had served. The shy, unsuccessful lawyer who had arrived in Durban in 1893 had become an internationally recognized leader whose methods would soon be tested on a much larger stage. But first, he faced the challenge of returning to an India that had changed dramatically during his long absence, and determining how the lessons learned in South Africa could be applied to the vastly different conditions of the independence struggle at home. The final years of Gandhi's South African sojourn were marked by a deepening of his philosophical understanding and a refinement of the methods that would later shake the foundations of the British Empire. The Asiatic Registration Act crisis of 1906 had given birth to Satyagraha as a practical technique, but the years that followed would transform it into a comprehensive philosophy of social and political change. The word itself, Satyagraha, emerged from Gandhi's dissatisfaction with the English term passive resistance, which seemed to suggest weakness or inactivity. In reality, the method he was developing required enormous personal strength, active preparation, and sustained commitment under the most difficult circumstances. A contest organized through Indian Opinion solicited suggestions for a more appropriate term, eventually producing Satyagraha, literally truth force, or firmness in truth. The concept rested on several fundamental principles that Gandhi had derived from his study of religious texts, his observations of political movements, and his own experiences of resistance and imprisonment. First, satyagraha required absolute commitment to truth, not merely in the sense of factual accuracy, but in the deeper sense of acting in accordance with one's highest understanding of moral duty. Second, it demanded complete non-violence, not only in action, but in thought and emotion, treating opponents with respect and seeking their conversion rather than their defeat. Most challenging of all, satyagraha required participants to accept suffering willingly, viewing persecution as an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of their convictions and the justice of their cause. This concept of voluntary suffering as a form of political action was revolutionary in its implications, suggesting that moral authority could ultimately prove more powerful than physical force or legal coercion. The practical application of these principles required extensive preparation and discipline that went far beyond the conventional requirements of political organizing. Participants in satyagraha campaigns were expected to undergo training that included not only the technical aspects of nonviolent resistance, but also the personal disciplines necessary to maintain their principles under extreme pressure. Gandhi's own daily routine during the major campaigns exemplified the integration of personal and political discipline that he demanded from all participants. He rose each morning at 4 a.m. for 2 hours of prayer and meditation, often including readings from the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, and the Quran. His breakfast consisted of simple fruits and nuts, designed to provide energy while maintaining the dietary restrictions that had become central to his identity. The morning hours were devoted to correspondence and planning, as Gandhi maintained an extensive network of supporters in India, Britain, and South Africa who required regular updates on developments and strategy. His letters from this period reveal meticulous attention to detail combined with broad strategic thinking as he worked to coordinate local resistance with international publicity and political pressure. Afternoon hours were typically spent in face-to-face organizing, as Gandhi traveled constantly between the Indian communities scattered across South Africa's major cities and mining districts. These visits served multiple purposes. They maintained morale during difficult periods, provided opportunities for education and training in satyagraha methods, and demonstrated Gandhi's personal commitment to sharing the risks and hardships faced by ordinary participants. The evening routine included public meetings and educational sessions where Gandhi explained the philosophical foundations of satyagraha and its practical applications. These sessions were conducted in multiple languages, English, Gujarati, Hindi, and Tamil, to ensure that all members of the Indian community could understand both the methods and the principles underlying their resistance. The 1913 campaign against the invalidation of non-Christian marriages represented the culmination of Gandhi's South African work and demonstrated the full potential of satyagraha as a method of social transformation. The government's decision to declare Hindu and Islamic marriages legally invalid was a direct attack on the cultural and religious foundations of Indian family life, provoking outrage that transcended the community's usual divisions. Gandhi's response revealed the sophisticated strategic thinking that had evolved during 7 years of satyagraha campaigns. Rather than organizing immediate protests, he spent weeks building consensus within the Indian community, ensuring that the response would be unified and sustained. He reached out to women's organizations, religious leaders, and labor groups, creating a coalition that included every segment of the Indian population. The campaign began with small acts of symbolic resistance designed to establish the moral framework and build momentum for larger confrontations. Indian women began crossing provincial boundaries without permits, courting arrest while maintaining absolute non-violence and dignity. These early arrests generated publicity while demonstrating the participants' commitment to their cause and their method. Gandhi himself set the example by leading his wife and other women in a march from Phoenix settlement to protest the marriage. law. When they were arrested, he organized a support march that brought hundreds of additional protesters to the provincial borders. Each arrest was conducted with careful attention to non-violent principles, with participants offering no resistance while also refusing to cooperate with procedures they viewed as illegitimate. The movement's expansion to include indentured laborers marked a crucial turning point in both its scope and its effectiveness. When Indian coal miners in Newcastle went on strike in October 1913, they demonstrated that satyagraha could mobilize not only middle-class professionals but also workers whose daily survival depended on their employment. The strike eventually involved over 50,000 workers across multiple industries, bringing the colonial economy to a virtual standstill. Gandhi's leadership during this crisis required him to balance multiple competing demands while maintaining the non-violent character of the movement. He had to coordinate with strike leaders while ensuring that labor disputes did not overshadow the political goals of the campaign. He needed to maintain international support while preventing the government from portraying the movement as economically motivated rather than principled resistance to unjust laws. Most challenging of all, he had to sustain morale and discipline among thousands of participants who were facing imprisonment, loss of employment, and physical hardship. His solution was to establish temporary camps where striking workers and their families could receive food and shelter while maintaining the communal discipline that had been developed at Phoenix Settlement. These camps became laboratories for the kind of society Gandhi envisioned emerging from successful satyagraha campaigns. Participants shared resources according to need rather than contribution, with professionals and laborers working side by side in food preparation, childcare, and camp maintenance. Religious observances included multiple traditions, with daily prayers that drew from Hindu, Christian, and Islamic texts. The educational program in the camps reflected Gandhi's belief that political liberation required personal transformation. Adults attended classes in literacy, health, and political organization, while children received instruction that emphasized moral development alongside academic subjects. The goal was to prepare participants for the responsibilities of citizenship in a society based on justice and equality rather than racial hierarchy. The government's response to the 1913 campaign revealed both the effectiveness of satyagraha and the limitations of purely coercive approaches to political control. Mass arrests filled the jails beyond capacity, but each arrest generated additional publicity and sympathy for the Indian cause. Physical force against non-violent protesters created powerful images that undermined the government's legitimacy both domestically and internationally. The shooting of striking workers at several mines produced a particularly strong international reaction, with British politicians, church leaders, and newspaper editors questioning whether such methods were compatible with the values of a civilized society. The government found itself in the impossible position of either accepting the protesters' demands or escalating repression to levels that would provoke even stronger opposition. The breakthrough came through Gandhi's decision to lead a march of over 2,000 protesters from Natal into the Transvaal, deliberately violating immigration laws while maintaining absolute non-violence. The march was conducted with military precision, with participants trained in the principles of satyagraha and committed to accepting arrest without resistance. Gandhi himself was arrested early in the march, but the participants continued under new leadership, demonstrating that the movement had developed beyond dependence on any single individual. The march captured international attention in ways that previous protests had not, partly because of its symbolic power and partly because of the disciplined behavior of the participants. Newspaper correspondents and photographers documented every stage of the journey, creating a visual record that contradicted government claims about the violent or unreasonable character of Indian demands. The resulting Gandhi-Smuts Agreement of 1914 addressed virtually all of the Indian community's major grievances while establishing important precedents for the resolution of racial conflicts through negotiation rather than force. The three tax was abolished, Hindu and Islamic marriages were recognized, and immigration restrictions were substantially eased. Perhaps most importantly, the agreement demonstrated that a small, politically powerless minority could achieve significant concessions through sustained, non-violent resistance. As Gandhi prepared for his departure from South Africa in July 1914, he reflected on the lessons of 21 years that had transformed him from a failed lawyer into an internationally recognized leader. The methods he had developed in response to specific local conditions had proved applicable across cultural and class divisions, suggesting their potential for addressing the much larger challenges awaiting him in India. The personal transformation had been equally significant. The shy, awkward young man who had struggled to speak in a Bombay courtroom had developed the confidence and skills necessary to lead complex political campaigns while maintaining his principles under extreme pressure. Most importantly, he had discovered that individual moral authority, properly applied, could become a form of political power more durable and effective than conventional approaches based on wealth, connections, or force. The question that would guide his next phase of development was already taking shape. Could the methods that had succeeded against racial discrimination in South Africa be adapted to challenge the much larger system of imperial control that governed India? The answer would require him to test satyagraha against opponents far more powerful and sophisticated than the provincial politicians he had faced in Natal and the Transvaal. But first, he would need to re-establish himself in a homeland that had changed dramatically during his long absence and convince Indian political leaders that his unconventional methods deserved serious consideration. The steamship that carried Gandhi back to Bombay Harbour in January 1915 brought with it a reputation that had travelled faster than the man himself. News of his South African campaigns had been extensively covered in the Indian press, transforming him from an unknown lawyer into a figure of considerable interest to the country's political establishment. The title, Mahatma, Great Soul, had already begun to attach itself to his name, though he would never be entirely comfortable with the reverence it implied. His arrival on January 9, 1915, was marked by receptions that demonstrated both his newfound prominence and the expectations that accompanied it. At 7:30 a.m., as his ship docked, crowds had already gathered at the harbour to welcome him home. The Times of India interviewed him that same day, while political leaders including Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Vallabhbhai Sardar Patel arranged meetings to assess this unusual addition to India's political leadership. The week following his arrival revealed the complexity of his position in Indian society. On January 10th, he attended receptions organized by various communities, residents of the fort area, the Modbania community of his birth, and the National Union, where Bal Gangadhar Tilak was present. Each gathering reflected different expectations about his role and different interpretations of the significance of his South African work. The Mod community celebration at Jivandas Pitambada's bungalow was particularly revealing of the tensions Gandhi would face. His caste community was proud of his international prominence but concerned about the unconventional methods that had brought him fame. His advocacy for indentured labourers and his willingness to associate with people of all backgrounds had raised questions about his commitment to traditional social hierarchies. The reception organised by the Petit family on January 12th, presided over by Sir Firozshah Mehta, represented the pinnacle of Bombay's social and political establishment. The event was conducted with pomp and grandeur that made Gandhi visibly uncomfortable, as it embodied exactly the kind of elite politics he had learned to distrust during his South African years. The contrast between this elaborate celebration and the simple communal life at Phoenix Settlement could not have been more stark. Gandhi's response to these receptions established patterns that would characterize his entire Indian career. He attended the events out of respect for his hosts and recognition of their political importance, but he used his speeches to articulate a vision of Indian nationalism quite different from the constitutional approaches favored by most established leaders. Rather than focusing on legislative reform or gradual expansion of Indian participation in government, he spoke about the need for moral regeneration and mass participation in political action. His decision to remain politically inactive during his first year in India reflected both practical wisdom and deeper philosophical commitments. Gokhale, who had become his mentor and guide, advised him to spend at least a year traveling throughout the country to understand conditions that had changed dramatically during his 21-year absence. More fundamentally, Gandhi believed that effective political leadership required intimate knowledge of the people's actual circumstances rather than abstract theoretical understanding. The establishment of his ashram at Sabarmati, near Ahmedabad, in May 1915 provided the foundation for this period of preparation and study. The location was carefully chosen for its proximity to both urban political centers and rural areas where the majority of Indians still lived. The ashram's daily routine replicated many elements of the Phoenix settlement, but adapted to Indian conditions and cultural expectations. Life at Sabarmati began each day at 4 a.m. with communal prayers that included readings from multiple religious traditions. The morning hours were devoted to physical labor, spinning, weaving, farming, and construction work, with all residents participating regardless of their educational background or social status. Meals were simple vegetarian fare prepared and consumed communally with careful attention to nutrition and economy. The ashram's educational program reflected Gandhi's evolving understanding of the relationship between personal transformation and political change. Children received instruction in multiple languages, practical skills, and moral development, while adults participated in regular discussions of political and philosophical questions. The goal was to create a model community that could demonstrate the values and methods Gandhi hoped to promote throughout India. The first major test of Gandhi's Indian leadership came in 1917 with the Champaran Satyagraha, a campaign that would establish his reputation as a mass organizer while revealing the potential of his South African methods when applied to Indian conditions. The invitation came from Raj Kumar Shukla, a local peasant leader who had been trying unsuccessfully to attract political attention to the grievances of indigo farmers in Bihar. The indigo system represented one of the most exploitative forms of colonial agriculture, requiring peasants to dedicate a portion of their land to growing indigo for export while receiving minimal compensation. The farmers were trapped in a cycle of debt and legal harassment that made resistance extremely dangerous, but crop failures and market changes had made their situation desperate. Gandhi's initial response reflected the careful preparation that had become central to his political method. Rather than immediately organizing protests, he spent weeks in Champaran studying the legal framework, interviewing farmers, and documenting the specific grievances that would form the basis of their demands. This methodical approach contrasted sharply with the more impulsive methods favored by many nationalist leaders. His arrival in Motihari on April 16, 1917, traveling by elephant to visit remote villages, immediately attracted government attention. Local officials, who had ignored the farmers' complaints for years, suddenly became concerned about outside agitation and served Gandhi with an order to leave the district immediately. His refusal to comply led to his arrest and created exactly the kind of confrontation that Satyagraha was designed to provoke. The court proceedings on April 19th provided Gandhi with a platform to articulate the principles underlying his resistance. His statement to the court, pleading guilty to the technical charge while explaining his moral obligation to remain and investigate the farmers' grievances, received extensive press coverage and established the framework for subsequent civil Disobedience campaigns. The government's decision to withdraw the case on April 21st represented a significant victory that had implications far beyond the immediate issues in Champaran. For the first time, colonial authorities had backed down in the face of satyagraha resistance, demonstrating that the methods developed in South Africa could be effective against British administration in India. The subsequent investigation of farmers' grievances revealed systematic exploitation that had been ignored by both local and imperial authorities for decades. Gandhi's careful documentation of specific cases, combined with his legal expertise and media skills, created a comprehensive record that made denial impossible and reform inevitable. The Champaran campaign also demonstrated Gandhi's evolving approach to mass organizing in Indian conditions. Rather than relying on established political networks or traditional leadership structures, he worked directly with ordinary peasants while building alliances with local intellectuals and activists. This combination of grassroots organizing and elite support would become the foundation of all his major campaigns. The success in Champaran was followed quickly by the Ahmedabad mill strike of 1918, which tested Gandhi's methods in an urban, industrial setting. The dispute arose from mill owners' refusal to honor agreements about worker compensation during a period of wartime inflation. The workers, facing deteriorating living conditions, sought Gandhi's assistance in organizing an effective response. His approach to the strike reflected lessons learned in Champaran about the importance of careful preparation and clear moral principles. Rather than focusing solely on economic demands, he framed the dispute in terms of justice and mutual obligation, arguing that mill owners had moral responsibilities to their workers that transcended mere legal requirements. The strike's most dramatic moment came when Gandhi announced his intention to fast until the dispute was resolved fairly. This decision, made on September 15th after several weeks of ineffective negotiations, transformed the character of the conflict by making Gandhi's physical well-being dependent on a just settlement. The mill owners, who had been prepared to outlast, the workers, economically, found themselves facing moral pressure that their purely economic calculations could not address. His declaration that as long as your wages are not raised by 35%, I shall not eat nor sit in a motor car, demonstrated the integration of personal and political discipline that characterized his mature method. The fast was not merely a negotiating tactic, but an expression of his belief that leadership required sharing the risks and sacrifices demanded of ordinary participants. The successful resolution of the Ahmedabad strike established Gandhi's reputation as an effective mediator in industrial disputes while demonstrating the potential applications of satyagraha beyond purely political conflicts. The methods he developed, careful investigation of grievances, principled negotiation, and willingness to accept personal sacrifice, would become standard elements of his approach to social and economic problems. The Kheda Satyagraha of 1918 completed Gandhi's apprenticeship in Indian conditions and established him as a national political figure. The campaign arose from the government's refusal to provide tax relief following crop failures that had left farmers unable to pay their assessments. The issue was both practical, farmers facing starvation could not pay taxes, and symbolic, representing the colonial government's indifference to Indian suffering. Gandhi's strategy in Kheda reflected his growing sophistication in mass organizing and his deepening understanding of the relationship between local and national politics. The campaign combined detailed legal arguments about the government's obligations with mass education about peasant rights and collective action. Most importantly, it demonstrated that satyagraha could be sustained over long periods while maintaining discipline and non-violence among thousands of participants. The campaign officially began on March 22nd of 1918 with Gandhi's public declaration that the peasants would refuse to pay taxes until the government provided appropriate relief. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with villages throughout the district pledging their support despite the obvious risks of government retaliation. The months that followed tested every aspect of Gandhi's leadership and organizational abilities. He traveled constantly between villages, maintaining morale while ensuring that resistance remained non-violent and disciplined. His daily routine during this period included early morning meetings with local leaders, afternoon addresses to mass gatherings, and evening sessions devoted to planning and correspondence. The government's response revealed both the effectiveness of satyagraha and the limitations of purely coercive approaches to political control. Attempts to collect taxes through force generated resistance that spread beyond the original participants, while arrests of leaders created martyrs whose suffering strengthened the movement's moral authority. The campaign's successful conclusion. In June 1918, with the government agreeing to suspend tax collection from the most affected areas, established Gandhi as the preeminent leader of India's peasant population. More importantly, it demonstrated that satyagraha could achieve practical political goals while maintaining the moral principles that distinguished it from conventional forms of resistance. As 1918 drew to a close, Gandhi faced the challenge of applying the lessons learned in these local campaigns to the much larger questions of Indian independence and imperial reform. The success in Champaran, Ahmedabad, and Khader had established his credibility and demonstrated the effectiveness of his methods, but they had also raised expectations that would require him to take on opponents far more powerful than provincial administrators and local mill owners. The question that would define his next phase of development was becoming increasingly urgent. Could the methods that had succeeded in specific local contexts be scaled up to challenge the fundamental structures of imperial rule? The answer would require him to test satyagraha against the full power of the British Empire, a confrontation that would transform both Indian nationalism and Gandhi's own understanding of political resistance. The transition from local campaigns to national leadership required Gandhi to navigate political waters far more complex than anything he had encountered in South Africa or during his early Indian experiments. The end of World War I in 1918 brought with it both opportunities and dangers for the Indian independence movement, as the colonial government struggled to balance promises of greater self-governance with determination to maintain imperial control. The Rowlatt crisis of 1919 provided Gandhi with his first opportunity to apply satyagraha to a truly national issue. The legislation, which extended wartime emergency powers and allowed the government to imprison political suspects without trial, represented everything Gandhi opposed about arbitrary colonial rule. More importantly, it offered a clear moral framework that could unite Indians across regional, religious, and class divisions. His call for a nationwide satyagraha campaign marked a dramatic escalation in both the scope and ambition of non-violent resistance. Unlike his previous campaigns, which had focused on specific local grievances, the Rowlatt Satyagraha aimed at challenging fundamental aspects of colonial authority through coordinated action across the entire subcontinent. The campaign began on April 6, 1919, with a day of fasting and prayer designed to demonstrate the moral seriousness of Indian opposition to the Rowlatt Act. Gandhi's strategy reflected lessons learned during his local campaigns about the importance of combining political action with personal discipline and religious observance. The day was conceived not merely as a protest, but as an act of spiritual purification that would prepare participants for the sacrifices that sustained resistance would require. The immediate response exceeded Gandhi's most optimistic expectations, with millions of Indians participating in Hartal, general strike activities that brought business and transportation to a standstill in major cities. The success of the initial day of protest demonstrated both the potential reach of satyagraha and the organizational challenges of maintaining discipline among such vast numbers of participants. Gandhi's daily routine during this period reflected the enormous demands of national leadership. He rose each morning at 4 a.m. for prayers and meditation, but the traditional 2-hour period was often shortened by the press of urgent correspondence and planning meetings. His breakfast remained simple: fruits, nuts, and goat's milk, but was frequently consumed while traveling between meetings or reviewing the flood of reports arriving from local organizers. The morning hours were typically devoted to strategy, sessions with key lieutenants like Vallabhbhai Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, and other emerging leaders of the independence movement. These meetings required Gandhi to balance competing demands for his attention while maintaining the unified direction that effective mass campaigns required. His approach to leadership during this period emphasized collective decision-making and shared responsibility, but the final authority for major strategic decisions remained clearly his. Afternoon activities usually involved public meetings where Gandhi addressed crowds that often numbered in the tens of thousands. These speeches required him to explain complex political and philosophical concepts in language accessible to audiences that included illiterate peasants, urban workers, and educated professionals. His speaking style during this period was conversational, rather than oratorical, emphasizing personal connection with his listeners rather than rhetorical flourishes. The evening hours were devoted to correspondence that connected local activities with national strategy and international publicity. Gandhi's letters from this period reveal meticulous attention to detail, combined with broad strategic thinking, as he worked to coordinate resistance activities while maintaining the non-violent character that distinguished satyagraha from other forms of political action. The campaign's most serious test came with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre on April 13, 1919, when British troops fired on an unarmed crowd in Amritsar, killing hundreds of civilians. The atrocity created enormous pressure for violent retaliation, testing Gandhi's ability to maintain non-violent discipline in the face of government brutality. His response to Jallianwala Bagh revealed both his moral courage and his growing political sophistication. Rather than allowing outrage to drive the movement toward violence, he used the massacre to strengthen the moral case for satyagraha while demanding government accountability through legal and political channels. His careful documentation of the events, combined with demands for official inquiries and compensation for victims' families, demonstrated that non-violent resistance could respond effectively to government violence without abandoning its principles. The personal cost of maintaining this position was enormous. Gandhi's private correspondence from this period reveals the anguish he felt about the deaths of innocents and his constant worry that his methods were inadequate to protect his followers from government brutality. Yet his public statements remained consistently focused on the long-term goals of the movement and the importance of maintaining moral authority even under extreme provocation. The decision to suspend the Rolat Satyagraha following outbreaks of violence in several cities demonstrated Gandhi's willingness to sacrifice short-term political gains to preserve the integrity of his method. This decision was controversial among many nationalist leaders who argued that momentum should be maintained regardless of isolated incidents of violence. Gandhi's response to these criticisms revealed his evolving understanding of the relationship between means and ends in political action. He argued that violence, even in response to provocation, would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken colonial rule by justifying government repression and alienating potential supporters. More fundamentally, he maintained that methods inconsistent with the goals of the movement would corrupt those goals even if they achieved temporary success. The period following the suspension of the Rolat Satyagraha was devoted to organizational consolidation and the development of what Gandhi called constructive program, positive activities designed to build Indian capacity for self-governance rather than merely opposing British rule. This approach reflected his growing conviction that independence would be meaningful only if Indians developed the skills and institutions necessary for effective democratic governance. The constructive program included efforts to promote khadi, hand-spun cloth, improve education and sanitation in villages, bridge communal divisions between Hindus and Muslims, and remove the practice of untouchability. Each of these activities was designed to address specific weaknesses that Gandhi believed made Indians vulnerable to imperial control while building the social solidarity necessary for sustained political resistance. His personal adoption of spinning as a daily practice exemplified the integration of symbolic and practical elements that characterized his mature political method. The time he spent each evening at his spinning wheel served multiple purposes. It provided a meditative activity that helped him process the day's events, demonstrated his commitment to economic self-reliance, and created a powerful visual symbol of Indian resistance to imperial exploitation. The spinning wheel also became central to Gandhi's daily routine and public image during this period. Photographs and newsreels from the early 1920s typically showed him seated at his charkha, working methodically through the cotton that had been prepared earlier in the day. This image resonated powerfully with Indians who understood both the economic and symbolic significance of hand spinning in a country whose textile industry had been destroyed by British industrial competition. The non-cooperation movement of 1920-1922 represented the culmination of Gandhi's efforts to scale up satyagraha from local campaigns to national resistance. The campaign combined opposition to specific government policies with a comprehensive program of Indian self-reliance designed to make colonial rule economically and politically unsustainable. The movement's launch required Gandhi to build unprecedented levels of cooperation among India's diverse political organizations while maintaining the disciplined approach that distinguished satyagraha from more conventional forms of protest. His strategy included the coordination of activities among the Indian National Congress, the All India Muslim League, and regional political organizations, each with their own priorities and constituencies. The practical challenges of organizing non-cooperation among hundreds of millions of people required innovations in communication, coordination, and leadership development that pushed Gandhi's organizational abilities to their limits. His solution was to create a network of local leaders trained in satyagraha principles who could adapt national strategy to local conditions while maintaining overall unity and discipline. The movement's most dramatic elements included boycotts of British goods, resignation from government service, withdrawal of students from colonial educational institutions, and refusal to participate in colonial courts and legislatures. Each of these activities was designed not merely to inconvenience the government, but to demonstrate Indian capacity for self-governance and economic independence. Gandhi's personal example during the non-cooperation movement established patterns of leadership that would characterize the remainder of his political career. He traveled constantly between regions, addressing mass meetings while consulting with local leaders about implementation challenges. His speeches during this period emphasized the connection between individual transformation and political change, arguing that independence would be achieved through the sum of millions of personal decisions to reject colonial authority. The movement's suspension following the Chauri Chaura incident in 1922, where protesters killed police officers, once again demonstrated Gandhi's willingness to sacrifice political momentum to preserve satyagraha principles. His decision to call off the campaign when it was achieving unprecedented success generated enormous controversy within the independence movement, but it also established his authority as the ultimate interpreter of non-violent resistance. His subsequent arrest and trial in 1922 provided a platform for one of his most important statements about the relationship between law and justice. His speech to the court, accepting moral responsibility for the violence that had occurred while maintaining that non-cooperation was both legally justified and morally necessary, received international attention and established him as one of the world's foremost advocates for civil disobedience. The 6 years he spent in prison from 1922 to 1924, and again from 1925 to 1926, provided opportunities for reflection and study that would profoundly influence his later campaigns. His daily routine in prison followed the patterns established during his South African incarcerations: early rising for prayer and meditation, compliance with prison labor requirements, and extensive reading in religious and political texts. His release in 1924 coincided with a period of political fragmentation and communal tension that tested his ability to maintain unity within the independence movement. The challenges of this period, rivalry between different nationalist factions, increasing violence between Hindus and Muslims, and government efforts to exploit these divisions, required Gandhi to develop new approaches to political leadership that emphasized reconciliation and patience rather than dramatic confrontation. As the 1920s progressed, Gandhi faced growing pressure from within the independence movement to launch another major satyagraha campaign. Younger leaders like Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose argued that the momentum generated by non-cooperation could not be sustained indefinitely through constructive program activities alone. The question that would define Gandhi's next phase of leadership was becoming increasingly urgent. When and how should satyagraha be resumed on a national scale? The answer, when it came, would take the form of one of the most brilliant and effective political campaigns in the history of resistance movements: a march to the sea that would capture the imagination of the world while demonstrating the mature power of non-violent resistance against seemingly overwhelming odds. By 1930, Gandhi had spent 15 years developing and refining the methods that would culminate in what many historians consider the most effective single campaign in the history of non-violent resistance. The Salt March to Dandi represented not merely a protest against a specific law, but a masterpiece of political theatre that combined practical organizing with symbolic power in ways that transformed both Indian nationalism and international understanding of civil disobedience. The choice of salt as the focus for renewed satyagraha reflected Gandhi's sophisticated understanding of how to frame political issues for maximum impact. The salt tax affected every Indian regardless of region, religion, or class, yet it represented a broader pattern of imperial exploitation that reduced Indians to dependency in their own land. Most importantly, the production of salt from seawater was a simple, natural process that anyone could understand and perform, making resistance both accessible and deeply symbolic. Gandhi's letter to Viceroy Lord Irwin on March 2, 1930, formally announcing his intention to begin civil disobedience in 10 days, demonstrated the careful preparation that characterized all his major campaigns. The letter systematically outlined Indian grievances against British rule, while offering the government a final opportunity to address them through negotiation rather than confrontation. The document was both a political manifesto and a personal appeal, combining detailed legal and economic arguments with expressions of respect for Irwin as an individual. This approach reflected Gandhi's consistent belief that effective resistance required opponents to be treated as potential converts rather than enemies, and that even the most serious political conflicts could be resolved through moral persuasion, if properly conducted. The 10-day period between the letter and the beginning of the march was used for intensive preparation that revealed the organizational sophistication Gandhi had developed over 3 decades of political work. Sabarmati Ashram became the center of a communications network that extended throughout India, with detailed instructions sent to local leaders about how to support the campaign while maintaining non-violent discipline. The selection of participants for the march itself reflected Gandhi's understanding of the symbolic and practical requirements of effective civil disobedience. The initial group of 79 marchers was carefully chosen to represent different regions, religions, and social backgrounds, creating a microcosm of Indian diversity united around shared principles of resistance. The age range of participants, from teenagers to men in their 70s, demonstrated that satyagraha could engage Indians at every stage of life, while their social backgrounds, peasants, intellectuals, artisans, and professionals, showed that the movement transcended traditional class divisions. Most importantly, each participant had undergone training in non-violent resistance and committed to accepting whatever consequences their actions might produce. Gandhi's personal preparation for the march reflected the integration of spiritual and political elements that characterized his mature approach to leadership. His daily routine in the weeks before departure included extended periods of prayer and meditation, careful attention to physical fitness through walking and simple exercises, and meticulous planning of every aspect of the journey. The march began on March 12, 1930, with Gandhi leading the small group of followers out of Sabarmati Ashram toward the Arabian Sea, 240 miles away. The pace was deliberately slow, approximately 10 miles per day, to allow time for meetings in villages along the route and to ensure that news of the march could spread ahead of the marchers themselves. Gandhi's daily routine during the march established patterns that would be repeated in subsequent campaigns. Each day began at 4 a.m. with prayers that included readings from multiple religious traditions, emphasizing the universal spiritual principles underlying political resistance. The early morning hours were devoted to correspondence and planning, as Gandhi maintained contact with supporters throughout India while coordinating media coverage of the march's progress. The actual walking typically began around 6 a.m., with Gandhi setting a pace that could be maintained by the oldest participants while allowing for frequent stops to address crowds that gathered along the route. His appearance during these weeks, the white homespun dhoti, the simple sandals, the walking stick that would become one of his most recognizable symbols, created a powerful visual image of Indian simplicity confronting imperial complexity. The village meetings held each evening served multiple purposes within Gandhi's overall strategy. They provided opportunities to explain the principles of satyagraha to rural audiences who might be unfamiliar with non-violent resistance, while demonstrating that political leadership could emerge from and speak directly to ordinary people, rather than working through traditional hierarchies. These meetings also served as training sessions for local leaders who would continue the campaign after the marchers had passed through their areas. Gandhi's speeches during this period emphasized practical aspects of civil disobedience, how to maintain discipline during confrontations with police, how to organize community support for arrested protesters, how to sustain resistance over long periods, while connecting these tactical considerations to larger questions of moral and political principle. The physical demands of the march tested Gandhi's endurance in ways that surprised both supporters and critics. At 61, he was the oldest member of the group, yet he maintained the daily pace without difficulty while carrying the additional burden of leadership responsibilities. His ability to combine physical stamina with intellectual clarity and emotional stability during this period demonstrated the effectiveness of the personal disciplines he had developed over decades of practice. Media coverage of the march created the international attention that Gandhi had carefully planned from the beginning. Newspaper correspondents and photographers accompanied the marchers, sending daily reports and images that brought the campaign to global attention in ways that previous satyagraha efforts had not achieved. The visual elements of the march were particularly powerful for international audiences unfamiliar with Indian politics or the specific issues involved in the salt tax. The image of an elderly man in simple clothing leading a small group of followers against the British Empire created a David and Goliath narrative that transcended cultural and political boundaries. More importantly, the march's careful choreography, The daily routine of prayer, walking, and public meetings demonstrated the disciplined character of Satyagraha in ways that contradicted British claims about Indian unfitness for self-governance. International observers could see for themselves that the marchers were neither fanatics nor agitators, but disciplined citizens engaged in principled resistance to unjust laws. The arrival at Dandi on April 5, 1930 drew tens of thousands of supporters, who had travelled from across Gujarat to witness the symbolic breaking of the salt law. Gandhi's actions on the morning of April 6, picking up a small lump of natural salt from the beach, were deliberately simple and understated, but they triggered a nationwide campaign of civil disobedience that eventually involved millions of Indians. The government's response to the salt-making revealed both the effectiveness of Gandhi's strategy and the limitations of colonial authority when confronted with mass resistance based on moral rather than violent grounds. Police had attempted to prevent the salt-making by crushing existing deposits into the mud, but they could not prevent the formation of new salt from seawater without essentially closing all of India's coastline. The weeks following the Dandi salt-making saw the rapid spread of civil disobedience throughout India, as local leaders organized their own salt-making activities while expanding resistance to include other aspects of colonial law. Gandhi's daily routine during this period involved constant travel between areas of resistance, coordinating strategy, while maintaining the non-violent character that distinguished Satyagraha from other forms of protest. His arrest on May 5, 1930, was both expected and strategically planned, as Gandhi had designed the campaign to continue effectively without his direct leadership. The arrest itself was conducted with unusual courtesy by colonial authorities who recognized that any appearance of brutality would strengthen rather than weaken the resistance movement. The continuation of the campaign after Gandhi's imprisonment demonstrated the organizational maturity of the independence movement and the effectiveness of the training in satyagraha principles that had been conducted over the previous decade. The raid on the Dharasana salt works on May 21st, led by the poet Sarojini Naidu, provided some of the most powerful images of the entire campaign, as peaceful protesters endured brutal beatings without retaliation. The international reaction to Dharasana, particularly the reports filed by American journalist Webb Miller, created unprecedented pressure on the British government to find a negotiated solution to the Indian crisis. The images of disciplined, non-violent protesters being systematically beaten by colonial police contradicted every claim about the civilizing mission of imperialism while demonstrating the moral authority of the independence movement. Gandhi's release from prison in January 1931 was followed by negotiations with Lord Irwin that resulted in the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, suspending civil disobedience in exchange for Indian participation in constitutional discussions about the future of British rule. While the agreement fell short of immediate independence, it represented the first time that the colonial government had negotiated with Indian leaders as equals rather than subordinates. The Salt March's long-term significance extended far beyond its immediate political results. The campaign demonstrated that satyagraha could operate effectively on a national scale while maintaining the moral principles that distinguished it from conventional political action. More importantly, it established Gandhi as an international symbol of non-violent resistance and provided a model that would influence liberation movements throughout the world. As Gandhi prepared for the London Round Table Conference in August 1931, he faced the challenge of translating the moral victory achieved through the Salt March into concrete political progress toward independence. The question that would define his next phase of leadership was becoming increasingly complex. How could the momentum generated by mass civil disobedience be sustained through the necessarily slow process of constitutional negotiation and political compromise? The answer would require him to balance competing demands from within the independence movement while maintaining international support and preparing for what many suspected would be an even greater confrontation with British imperial authority. The Salt March had demonstrated what was possible through disciplined, non-violent resistance. The challenge now was to build upon that success in ways that would ultimately bring freedom to India, while preserving the principles that had made such freedom worth achieving. The period following the Salt March represented both the pinnacle of Gandhi's international recognition and one of the most challenging phases of his political career. The Gandhi-Irwin Pact of March 1931 had suspended civil disobedience in exchange for Indian participation in constitutional discussions, but it left fundamental questions about independence unresolved while creating tensions within the nationalist movement about the wisdom of compromise with imperial authority. Gandhi's decision to attend the London Round Table Conference as the sole representative of the Indian National Congress placed enormous pressure on his diplomatic skills and political judgment. The journey to London in August 1931 was itself laden with symbolic significance, as the simple-clad Indian leader travelled to the heart of the empire to negotiate with the same government he had spent decades resisting. His accommodations at London reflected his commitment to maintaining the principles that had defined his political career even while engaging in high-level diplomacy. Rather than accepting government hospitality or staying in luxury hotels, he chose to lodge in the East End settlement house of Muriel Lester, a Christian social worker whose commitment to serving the poor aligned with his own values. The daily routine Gandhi maintained during his 3 months in London demonstrated his ability to adapt his personal practices to radically different circumstances while preserving their essential character. He rose each morning at 4 a.m. for prayers and meditation, though the unfamiliar surroundings and constant schedule of meetings required adjustments to the extended spiritual practices he preferred. His breakfast remained strictly vegetarian and simple, fruits, nuts, and goat's milk, but was often consumed while reviewing briefing materials for the day's negotiations or correspondence from India, updating him on political developments during his absence. The morning hours were typically devoted to formal conference sessions where representatives of different Indian communities and British political parties attempted to forge consensus on constitutional arrangements. The Round Table Conference sessions revealed both Gandhi's strengths and limitations as a negotiator in formal diplomatic settings. His moral authority and international recognition gave weight to his positions, but his insistence on principles over pragmatic compromise frustrated both British officials and other Indian representatives who preferred incremental progress over dramatic confrontation. The conference's most contentious issue centered on separate electorates for different religious communities, particularly the question of special representation for Muslims and Dalits, untouchables. Gandhi's opposition to separate electorates reflected his belief that such arrangements would permanently fragment Indian society and make genuine independence impossible, but his position put him at odds with leaders of these communities who viewed separate representation as essential protection for their interests. His afternoon activities in London typically included visits to British political leaders, religious organisations, and social reform groups that could potentially support the Indian cause. These meetings required Gandhi to explain complex Indian political and social issues to audiences with limited understanding of subcontinental realities, while building sympathy for independence among influential British constituencies. The evening hours were devoted to public meetings where Gandhi addressed British audiences about the moral and practical arguments for Indian independence. His speaking style during these events was conversational rather than oratorical, emphasizing personal connection and shared human values rather than abstract political theory. These sessions often extended late into the night, as audiences were eager to question someone whose reputation had been built through newspaper reports rather than direct experience. The conference's ultimate failure to produce meaningful constitutional progress reflected the fundamental incompatibility between Indian demands for genuine self-governance and British determination to maintain imperial control through modified administrative arrangements. Gandhi's return to India in December 1931 was followed almost immediately by the resumption of civil disobedience, as it became clear that negotiation alone would not achieve independence. His arrest on January 4, 1932, within a week of resuming satyagraha activities, began what would prove to be one of his longest and most significant periods of imprisonment. The nearly 2 years he spent in Yeravda jail from 1932 to 1934 provided opportunities for reflection, study, and spiritual development that would profoundly influence his approach to the final phase of the independence struggle. The prison routine Gandhi established during this period reflected his evolving understanding of the relationship between personal transformation and political change. His day began at 4 a.m. with extended prayers and meditation that often lasted until sunrise, as the absence of political responsibilities allowed him to return to the spiritual practices that had been central to his development but had been increasingly squeezed by leadership demands. His reading during this imprisonment was extensive and eclectic, ranging from religious texts in multiple traditions to works on economics, education, and social reform. His correspondence from this period reveals deepening engagement with questions about post-independence India's social and economic structure, as he began to articulate a vision of development based on village self-sufficiency rather than industrial modernization. The most dramatic event of this imprisonment was his fast unto death in September 1932 to protest the British government's decision to grant separate electorates for Dalits. The fast, which lasted 6 days and brought Gandhi close to death, generated enormous pressure for a compromise that would protect Dalit political interests while maintaining the unified electorate that Gandhi viewed as essential for Indian unity. The resulting Pune Pact, negotiated while Gandhi lay near death in his prison cell, increased Dalit representation within the general electorate while avoiding the separate electorate that he had opposed. The agreement demonstrated both the power of his moral authority, his potential death had mobilized millions of Indians, and the practical limitations of fasting as a political instrument, since it could not address the underlying social and economic inequalities that made political protection necessary for oppressed communities. His release from prison in May 1934 coincided with a period of reassessment within the independence movement about the effectiveness of mass civil disobedience. The government's harsh response to the renewed satyagraha had resulted in over 100,000 arrests and severe economic hardship for families dependent on imprisoned breadwinners, while constitutional progress remained elusive. Gandhi's response to this situation reflected his growing conviction that independence could not be achieved through resistance alone, but required the positive construction of alternative institutions and economic relationships. His decision to withdraw from active leadership of the Congress Party while focusing on constructive program activities puzzled many supporters who expected continued dramatic confrontation with British rule. The village development work that occupied much of Gandhi's attention from 1934 to 1939 represented both a return to his earliest interests and a sophisticated response to the challenges of preparing India for self-governance. His daily routine during this period involved constant travel between rural areas where he promoted khadi production, improved sanitation, education reform, and the elimination of untouchability. These activities were often dismissed by critics as diversions from the real work of political organizing, but Gandhi viewed them as essential preparation for independence. His argument was that freedom would be meaningful only if Indians developed the skills and institutions necessary for effective self-governance, and that such development required attention to the practical problems of daily life in the villages, where the vast majority of Indians lived. The personal transformation Gandhi underwent during this period was as significant as his political evolution. The man who had once been energized by the drama of mass confrontation with imperial authority became increasingly focused on quiet, patient work with individuals and small communities. His correspondence from these years reveals growing contentment, with activities that produced little public attention but contributed to the slow process of social change. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 forced Gandhi back into national political leadership as the independence movement faced its greatest crisis since the Mutiny of 1857. The British government's decision to involve India in the war, without consulting Indian opinion, crystallized all the accumulated grievances of nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule while creating new opportunities for resistance. The debate within the Congress Party about the appropriate response to the war revealed fundamental disagreements about strategy, timing, and principles that had been papered over during previous campaigns. Younger leaders like Nehru and Bose favored immediate confrontation that would take advantage of Britain's military vulnerability, while Gandhi preferred a more measured approach that would preserve the non-violent character of the independence movement. His position reflected both tactical considerations about the effectiveness of resistance during wartime and deeper philosophical commitments about the relationship between means and ends in political action. Gandhi argued that independence achieved through methods that compromised satyagraha principles would ultimately prove unsustainable, while resistance that maintained moral authority would strengthen India's position regardless of immediate military outcomes. The Cripps mission of March 1942, which offered limited self-governance in exchange for Indian support of the war effort, represented the last serious attempt at constitutional compromise before the final confrontation between Indian nationalism and British imperialism. Gandhi's rejection of the Cripps proposals, despite their apparent concessions to Indian demands, reflected his conviction that partial independence would prove more harmful than continued resistance. His analysis of the Cripps offer revealed the sophisticated political understanding he had developed over 3 decades of struggle with imperial authority. He recognized that the proposed arrangements would create the appearance of Indian self-governance while preserving British control over defense, foreign policy, and economic planning, the areas that ultimately determined a country's independence. As 1942 progressed, pressure mounted within the independence movement for a final, decisive confrontation with British rule. The question facing Gandhi was no longer whether such a confrontation was necessary, but how it could be conducted in ways that would preserve the principles that had guided the movement while maximizing the chances of success against an opponent, fighting for its global survival. The answer, when it came, would take the form of the most comprehensive challenge to imperial authority in Indian history, a campaign that would test every lesson Gandhi had learned about mass organizing, non-violent resistance, and moral authority against the full power of an empire at war. The summer of 1942 found Gandhi facing what he knew might be his final opportunity to lead a mass movement for Indian independence. At 73, his physical stamina was beginning to show the effects of decades of fasting, imprisonment, and constant travel, yet his moral authority and political judgment remained at their peak. The failure of the Cripps mission had convinced him that the British government would never voluntarily grant meaningful independence, making a final confrontation both inevitable and necessary. The decision to launch what would become known as the Quit India movement reflected Gandhi's most sophisticated understanding of the relationship between domestic resistance and international politics. His strategy was based on the calculation that Britain's involvement in World War II created both opportunities and constraints that could be exploited through carefully calibrated civil disobedience. The months of preparation leading up to the movement's launch revealed the organizational maturity that the independence movement had achieved under Gandhi's leadership. His daily routine during this period included extensive consultations with Congress leaders, detailed planning sessions about logistics and strategy, and careful attention to international publicity that would frame the campaign for global audiences. Politik's morning hours were typically devoted to strategy sessions where Gandhi worked with key lieutenants to address the practical challenges of organizing resistance on an unprecedented scale. These meetings required him to balance competing demands for dramatic action from younger leaders against his own preference for carefully planned campaigns that could be sustained over long periods. His correspondence during this period reveals both the excitement and anxiety he felt about launching what he suspected would be his final major campaign. Letters to close associates show his awareness that the movement's success or failure would determine his historical legacy while potentially affecting the global struggle against fascism then raging across Europe and Asia. The All India Congress Committee meeting at Bombay on August 8, 1942, where Gandhi delivered his famous Do or Die speech, represented the culmination of his career as a political organizer and public speaker. The address combined practical instructions for resistance with philosophical reflections on the meaning of independence and the responsibilities of citizenship in ways that captured both the immediate urgency of the political moment and the timeless principles underlying the struggle. His speech that evening lasted over an hour and covered topics ranging from specific tactics for non-violent resistance to broad visions of post-independence Indian society. The most memorable passage, his call for Indians to do or die in pursuit of freedom, was delivered with an intensity that surprised even long-time associates who had heard him speak hundreds of times over the previous decades. The immediate aftermath of the speech demonstrated both the effectiveness of Gandhi's organizing and the government's determination to prevent the movement from gaining momentum. Within hours of the session's conclusion, virtually the entire Congress leadership was arrested, including Gandhi himself, who was taken into custody at his lodgings before dawn on August 9th. His imprisonment at the Aga Khan Palace in Pune marked the beginning of what would prove to be his longest and most difficult period of detention. Unlike his previous imprisonments, which had been conducted in regular jails with other political prisoners, this confinement was designed to isolate him from the movement he had launched while providing physical comfort that would prevent the health crises that had marked his earlier fasts. The palace's luxurious surroundings created an ironic contrast to the simple lifestyle Gandhi had maintained for decades, but he adapted his daily routine to the circumstances while preserving the essential elements of discipline and spiritual practice that had sustained him throughout his career. His day began at 4 a.m. with extended prayers and meditation, followed by physical exercises designed to maintain health during what he suspected would be a prolonged confinement. The morning hours were devoted to extensive reading in religious and philosophical texts, as the absence of political responsibilities allowed him to return to the spiritual studies that had been central to his development but had been increasingly squeezed by leadership demands. His library during this period included works in multiple languages and traditions, reflecting his lifelong commitment to understanding diverse approaches to truth and meaning. Afternoon activities included correspondence with family members and close associates, though all letters were subject to government censorship that limited his ability to provide guidance to the movement that continued to unfold across India. His frustration with this isolation was evident in private writings from this period, as he struggled to maintain connection with events that would determine both his legacy and India's future. The news of his wife Kasturbai's declining health during the early months of 1943 added personal anguish to the political isolation of his imprisonment. Her presence at the palace provided emotional support during a period of unprecedented uncertainty, but her gradual decline forced Gandhi to confront the possibility that his political activities had exacted costs from his family that could never be fully repaid. The daily routine of caring for Kasturbai during her final illness revealed aspects of Gandhi's character that were rarely visible during his public activities. His correspondence from this period shows him wrestling with questions about the relationship between public duty and personal relationships that had troubled him throughout his adult life. Her death on February 22, 1944, after 44 years of marriage, represented both a personal tragedy and a political crisis for Gandhi. The loss of his closest companion and most trusted advisor came at a moment when the independence movement faced its greatest challenges, leaving him emotionally isolated at precisely the time when his leadership was most needed. The Quit India movement itself had evolved in directions that neither Gandhi nor the government had anticipated, as the arrest of national leaders had decentralized resistance in ways that made it both more difficult to control and more difficult to suppress. Local leaders throughout India had interpreted the "do or die" message according to their own understanding of the situation, leading to activities that ranged from peaceful demonstrations to sabotage of communications and transportation infrastructure. The scale of the resistance exceeded anything previously seen in Indian history, with over 100,000 arrests made during the first few months of the campaign. Government estimates indicated that protesters had attacked 550 post offices, 250 railway stations, and 70 police stations while cutting approximately 2,500 telegraph lines. The greatest level of violence occurred in Bihar, where the breakdown of normal administration led to virtual insurrection in some districts. The government's response demonstrated both the effectiveness of the resistance and the limitations of purely coercive approaches to political control. The deployment of 57 battalions of British troops to restore order revealed the extent to which normal administrative machinery had been overwhelmed, while the shooting of unarmed protesters generated the kind of international criticism that undermined Britain's moral position in the global war against fascism. Gandhi's enforced isolation meant that he could only follow these developments through censored newspaper reports and carefully edited government summaries, creating enormous frustration about his inability to provide guidance about maintaining non-violent discipline. His private writings from this period reveal anguish about incidents of violence that occurred in the movement's name, as he worried that his absence had allowed the campaign to drift away from satyagraha principles. His decision to begin a fast on February 10, 1943, was partly a response to government accusations that he bore moral responsibility for the violence that had occurred during the movement. The 21-day fast undertaken while he was still grieving Kasturbai's recent death brought him closer to death than any of his previous fasts and generated enormous pressure for his release. The fast's conclusion after 21 days, when Gandhi's condition had become life-threatening, demonstrated once again the power of his moral authority to focus national and international attention on Indian grievances. The worldwide concern for his health during this period revealed the extent to which he had become not merely an Indian political leader, but a global symbol of resistance to oppression. His gradual recovery during the spring of 1940 was followed by a period of reflection and writing that produced some of his most profound statements about the relationship between personal transformation and political change. His correspondence from this period reveals a man coming to terms with the possibility that independence might be achieved by others using methods quite different from those he had pioneered. The evolution of the Quit India movement during 1943 and 1944 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of decentralized resistance. Local leaders had shown remarkable creativity in adapting satyagraha principles to their specific circumstances, but the absence of national coordination had also led to activities that Gandhi would never have endorsed. The movement's ultimate suppression after nearly 2 years of resistance left him to contemplate whether his life's work had achieved its fundamental goals or had simply prepared the ground for others to complete. His release on May 6, 1944, due to declining health, brought him back into a political situation that had been transformed by both the Quit India movement and the larger dynamics of World War II. The British government's growing recognition that India was ungovernable in the long run, combined with the empire's weakened position after years of global warfare, had created new opportunities for the final push toward independence. The question that would define Gandhi's final years was becoming increasingly complex. How could he help guide India toward independence while ensuring that freedom would be achieved in ways that preserved the principles and institutions necessary for effective self-governance? The answer would require him to navigate between competing visions of India's future while confronting challenges that would test every lesson he had learned during 5 decades of political leadership. The final years of Gandhi's life were marked by a profound tension between the approaching triumph of Indian independence and his growing concern about the methods and consequences of that victory. His release from the Aga Khan Palace in May 1944 brought him back into a political landscape that had been transformed by the Quit India movement, World War II, and the emergence of new leaders whose visions of India's future differed significantly from his own. The daily routine Gandhi established after his release reflected both his advancing age and his determination to remain active in shaping India's transition to independence. At 75, he could no longer maintain the exhausting schedule of constant travel and mass meetings that had characterized his earlier campaigns, but his moral authority remained undiminished, and his strategic insights were more valuable than ever. His mornings began, as always, at 4 a.m., with prayers and meditation, but these sessions now extended longer than in previous decades as he sought spiritual guidance for challenges that seemed to exceed purely political solutions. The growing tension between Hindus and Muslims, the increasing likelihood of partition, and his own sense that independence might be achieved through methods incompatible with satyagraha principles created a need for deeper spiritual resources than political organizing could provide. The breakfast routine remained simple: fruits, nuts, and goat's milk, but was increasingly consumed in the company of visitors who sought his guidance on the complex questions surrounding independence negotiations. These morning consultations revealed both his continued intellectual sharpness and his growing concern about developments beyond his control. The failure of his talks with Muhammad Ali Jinnah in September 1944 marked a turning point in Gandhi's understanding of his role in India's final transition to independence. Despite weeks of patient negotiation, he was unable to bridge the gap between Congress demands for a unified India and Muslim League insistence on partition, leading him to recognize that the political momentum had moved beyond the reach of his traditional methods of consensus building. His response to this failure reflected the wisdom accumulated over 5 decades of political experience. Rather than escalating confrontation or withdrawing from public life, he chose to focus on the constructive work that had always been central to his vision of independence. His travels during 1945 and 1946 were devoted primarily to village development, education reform, and efforts to prevent the communal violence that was beginning to tear apart the social fabric of Indian society. The daily routine of these village visits revealed both Gandhi's enduring energy and his deep commitment to the ordinary people whose lives would be most affected by independence. He would arrive in villages by train or car, often traveling third class despite his international prominence, and spend days meeting with local leaders, addressing public gatherings, and observing conditions that rarely received attention from political leaders focused on constitutional negotiations. These visits also demonstrated his continuing ability to connect with rural audiences who might be intimidated by other political figures. His speaking style during this period was more conversational than ever, as he used simple language and local examples to explain complex issues while encouraging villagers to take greater responsibility for their own development. The cabinet. mission plan of 1946, which offered a path to independence through a federal structure that might preserve Indian unity, represented the last realistic hope for avoiding partition. Gandhi's qualified support for the plan reflected his recognition that compromise was necessary, but his private correspondence from this period reveals deep pessimism about the likelihood of success given the hardening positions of both the Congress and the Muslim League. The outbreak of serious communal violence in Calcutta in August 1946, following the Muslim League's call for Direct Action Day, confronted Gandhi with a crisis that would dominate his final years. The scale and brutality of the riots, which left thousands dead and tens of thousands homeless, represented exactly the kind of tragedy he had spent his life trying to prevent. His decision to travel to the riot-affected areas despite his advanced age and the obvious physical dangers demonstrated both his personal courage and his belief that moral leadership required direct engagement with suffering rather than remote commentary. His daily routine during these visits was structured around meeting with victims of violence, addressing mixed religious gatherings, and working with local leaders to restore peace. The most dramatic of these interventions came in Noakhali, Bengal, where Muslim mobs had killed hundreds of Hindus and forced thousands more to flee their homes. Gandhi's 4-month stay in the region from November 1946 to March 1947 represented perhaps the most challenging period of his entire career, as he attempted to restore trust between communities that had lived together peacefully for generations, but now viewed each other with fear and hatred. His village-to-village walking tour through Noakhali tested his physical endurance to its limits, while requiring diplomatic skills of the highest order. Each day's journey involved walking several miles between villages, often through areas where his safety could not be guaranteed, to hold prayer meetings that brought together members of both religious communities. The prayer meetings themselves became laboratories for the kind of inter-religious understanding that Gandhi hoped could be extended throughout India. Each session included readings from Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and other religious texts, demonstrating the shared spiritual foundations that transcended the political divisions threatening to tear the country apart. His personal routine during the Noakhali period reflected both the practical demands of village life and his determination to maintain the disciplines that had sustained him throughout his career. He rose at 4 a.m. for prayers, walked several miles to the day's destination, held multiple meetings with local leaders and ordinary villagers, addressed evening prayer sessions, and spent late hours writing letters and diary entries documenting the gradual progress toward communal harmony. The announcement of Lord Mountbatten's plan for partition in June 1947 represented both the achievement of independence and the failure of Gandhi's vision of a united India based on religious tolerance and mutual respect. His response to partition revealed the depth of his disappointment while demonstrating his commitment to making the best of circumstances beyond his control. Rather than opposing partition outright, which would have been futile given the political momentum behind the plan, he chose to focus on ensuring that the transition occurred with minimal violence and maximum protection for religious minorities who would find themselves isolated in hostile environments. His activities during the summer of 1947 were devoted to practical preparations for partition rather than dramatic protests that might increase rather than decrease communal tensions. The violence that accompanied partition, despite these efforts, represented the greatest tragedy of Gandhi's life and the apparent failure of everything he had worked to achieve. The death toll, which eventually reached several 100,000, and the displacement of millions of refugees demonstrated that independence had been achieved through methods that contradicted the fundamental principles of satyagraha. His decision to spend India's Independence Day, August 15, 1947, fasting and praying rather than celebrating, reflected both his personal anguish about partition and his determination to focus attention on the continuing work of building genuine freedom rather than merely political independence. The symbolic power of this gesture, the father of independence mourning rather than celebrating on the day of liberation, captured the complexity of emotions surrounding the birth of modern India and Pakistan. The final months of Gandhi's life were dominated by efforts to stop the communal violence that continued to ravage both countries and to ensure that the new governments honored their obligations to religious minorities. His daily routine during this period centered around prayer meetings at Birla House in New Delhi, where he had taken up residence to be close to government leaders and refugee camps. These prayer meetings, held each evening on the lawn behind Birla House, represented both a continuation of practices he had maintained for decades and an adaptation to the new circumstances of independence. The gatherings brought together people from all religious communities for collective prayers, readings from multiple scriptures, and Gandhi's brief addresses about the challenges facing the new nation. His final fast, begun on January 13, 1948, was undertaken to pressure the Indian government to release financial assets owed to Pakistan under the partition agreement. The decision to fast unto death at age 78, while still recovering from the emotional and physical exhaustion of the previous year's efforts, demonstrated both his continued willingness to sacrifice his life for his principles and his recognition that moral authority rather than political position was now his primary source of influence. The fast's conclusion after 5 days, when government and community leaders agreed to protect Muslim minorities and honor financial obligations to Pakistan, represented Gandhi's final major political victory. However, it also intensified the opposition he faced from Hindu extremists who viewed his advocacy for religious minorities as betrayal of Hindu interests in the newly independent nation. The morning routine Gandhi followed on January 30, 1948, his final day, reflected the patterns he had maintained for decades, while also revealing his awareness that his life might be in danger. He began the day with recitation of the Bhagavad Gita, worked on revisions to the Congress constitution he hoped to publish, took his usual bath and massage, and ate lunch while discussing the continuing communal violence in East Bengal. His afternoon meeting with Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and other government leaders focused on practical measures for protecting refugees and preventing further violence, demonstrating his continued engagement with the immediate challenges facing India despite his advancing age and declining health. The conversations revealed both his realistic assessment of the difficulties ahead and his optimism about India's ultimate capacity to overcome the divisions that threatened its stability. The walk to his final prayer meeting at 5:17 p.m. was delayed by these discussions, making him late for the first time in memory for the evening prayers that had become central to his daily routine. His decision to proceed despite the delay, supported by his grandniece Manuban, demonstrated his commitment to maintaining the regular spiritual practices that had sustained him throughout his life. The 3 shots fired by Nathuram Godse as Gandhi approached the prayer platform brought to an end a life that had been dedicated to demonstrating the power of non-violence against seemingly overwhelming odds. His final words, "Hey Ram," "O God," spoken as he fell to the ground, provided a fitting conclusion to a career that had always emphasized spiritual authority over political power. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed both the depth of popular devotion to Gandhi and the continued relevance of his methods and message. The massive funeral procession, which brought over 2 million people to the streets of Delhi, demonstrated that his moral authority had transcended political disagreements to become part of India's national identity. The international reaction to his death, including statements from world leaders across the political spectrum, confirmed his status as one of history's most significant figures, while highlighting the global relevance of the methods he had pioneered. Albert Einstein's observation that future generations will scarcely believe that such a man ever walked the earth captured both the uniqueness of Gandhi's achievement and the continuing challenge of applying his insights to contemporary problems. Mahatma's trial and execution of his assassins, completed in November 1949, provided a final demonstration of the new India's commitment to the rule of law and religious tolerance that Gandhi had advocated throughout his career. The government's decision to treat the case as a criminal matter rather than a political issue reflected both the strength of India's democratic institutions and the enduring influence of Gandhi's vision of justice based on truth rather than revenge. As India settled into the complex work of building a democratic society from the foundations Gandhi had helped establish, his legacy continued to evolve in ways that reflected both the success and the limitations of his life's work. The principles of non-violence, religious tolerance, and grassroots democracy that he had advocated became central to India's national identity, even as the practical challenges of governance required approaches he had not fully anticipated. The question of how Gandhi's methods and insights might be applied to contemporary problems remained as relevant in the years following his death as it had been during his lifetime. His demonstration that moral authority could triumph over political and military power provided inspiration for liberation movements around the world, while his emphasis on personal transformation as the foundation of social change offered insights that transcended specific political contexts.